Broadcasting live. It's America's longest running talk show on computers. It's Computer America, bringing you the biggest names in technology with guest interviews, new products, and your emails. Listen live at computeramerica.com on any device around the world. Email the show at live@computeramerica.com or find us on social media. Be sure to check out our website for contests, giveaways, show notes, live video stream, podcasts, and more. You're listening to Computer America.
Hello and welcome into the Computer America Show. We are the nation's longest running, nationally syndicated radio talk show on computers and technology. Thank you for joining us. I'm your host, Ben Crossman, and everyone out there, I hope you're doing wonderfully. I hope you're having a fantastic day and you are ready for some Computer America. So today on the program, if everything goes well, and that's looking a little shaky at the moment, we should have author Dr. Kiran Musunuru joining us, and he wrote a book about the CRISPR generation. And CRISPR is a technology that we've talked on the show before. It's the promise that it holds for future generations, for disease control, for so on and so forth. Really looking forward to what is actually possible. And actually, I see Kiran waiting in the lobby very patiently. So we're going to get to Kiran in just a moment. But everyone, before we get to that, computeramerica.com. That's where you'll find everything, including links to the show notes. Our guest, you're going to find a link to his book if you'd like to check that out. And of course, you're going to find anything that we talk about in the news segment, articles, videos, topics, reviews, things like that. Computeramerica.com, your one-stop shop for everything for the show. So, again, with that being said, I hope everyone's having a great day. You are ready for some Computer America, and I think we're actually just going to go ahead and jump right into it. So let me hit a few buttons here, and everyone, once again, help me welcome onto the show. I believe this is his first time here, and hey, this is going to be a lot of fun. So let's go ahead and introduce Dr. Kiran Musunuru once again, and he is the author of the CRISPR Generation. Kiran, how you doing? Welcome onto Computer America.
Thanks very much. I'm very glad to be on for the first time.
Our pleasure, our pleasure. And yeah, you're coming in loud and clear, and this sounds perfect. So why don't we go ahead and get a little bit of background on yourself? Obviously, I dare say that, as far as I am aware of kind of the CRISPR technology, and we're going to get a background on all of this kind of thing, but I can't say, and you probably know better, I can't say that anyone's an expert. Obviously, this is still very much in development. Only in recent years has at least it made mainstream news. Give us a bit of your background. You're a doctor of blank, and what really drew you to writing about this topic of CRISPR babies?
Sure. So I'm a cardiologist at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. So that means I take care of patients who have heart disease, who have heart attacks, and so forth. I'm a geneticist. I'm a researcher, which means that I study how genetics, how our genes can influence our risk of getting heart disease, and how we might be able to use that information to protect people from heart disease. And then finally, I'm a gene editor, by which I mean that I use gene editing technology in the research I do in my laboratory, but I'm also thinking about how to use gene editing to help patients, how to predict whether they're likelier or less likely to get a disease, and even better, potentially be able to use CRISPR gene editing technology to actually protect people from heart disease.
So you're not just speaking as someone who is, reading research papers and trying to keep up on the latest, twists and turns of this. You're actually using it to hopefully help people in your own practice, which is amazing. That's just the kind of person that we'd like to talk to here. Why don't we go ahead and thank you for your background. Why don't we go ahead and get some background on, I guess, the main topic that we're going to be talking about, which is CRISPR, CRISPR. If anyone out there would like to go do some Googling on their own, but talk about this technology because it's come up every now and again, and I think the biggest story that maybe introduced it to a lot of people was this idea of course, the babies that we're we're going to talk about. But let's just talk about the technology in general. When was it developed, and what does it actually do?
Yeah, so writ large, gene editing is a technology that allows us to make changes to genes in the DNA in the cells in our bodies. And so typically we're talking about genes that are related to health and disease. Now, there actually turn out to be several different gene editing tools,
Hmm.
but by far the most popular one, as you've said, is the one called CRISPR. And it's interesting because CRISPR actually was not invented per se. It actually naturally exists in bacteria. It's a way for bacteria to fight off viral infections. Bacteria get viral infections just like we do, it turns out. But I would say about 6 years ago, for the first time, scientists figured out how to adapt CRISPR and turn it into a gene editing tool that would work on human DNA in human cells and potentially in human bodies. Now,
Yeah.
CRISPR gene editing or other types of gene editing, you can really do two types of things with them. You can either turn off genes, and that actually turns out to be easier to do. Or if you want, you can make precise alterations to genes, such as correcting a mutation that causes a disease. That turns out to be more challenging, but it is feasible, and there are new technologies or new iterations of the technology that are allowing us to do this more capably than we were, say, 6 years ago.
Yeah, very interesting, and even compared to 6 years ago, I'm sure that we've made a lot of discoveries. And from what I hear, and this is just very much a consumer perspective, just someone listening to NPR, something like that in the car. The more that we learn about this kind of thing, the more we're learning that we really don't know all that much. And what I mean is that I think. And if you want to talk about some of the misconceptions before we talk about some of the capabilities, I think one of the big misconceptions I think that people have is that there are individual genes that you can you mentioned turning them off or kind of activating other ones, and people think there's like for baldness you're gonna flip one gene, and for something like maybe eye color you're gonna flip another, but overall. I think, and again, feel free to correct me, but it seems like if you want to change something that is as fundamental as, a genetic disease or height or hair color or things like that, you are actually talking about editing, almost the entire genome of a person, because even things that don't seem related whatsoever are actually in some ways, related. You have to do a lot of editing. It's not just little switches in a control room somewhere.
Sure. No, it's not quite so simple. So it can get very complicated, but we do have to make a distinction. So there are some people who unfortunately have genetic diseases, and these are diseases like sickle cell
Hmm.
disease and Huntington's disease, cystic fibrosis, and so forth. And in those cases, it is actually just one gene that's at fault. It has a mutation that wrecks the function of that gene, and that causes the disease. So that's one scenario. And in that scenario, what you would need to do is fix that gene, that single gene. And so you could make the change to one gene and actually cure the disease, or at least treat the disease, make it better. But you're right, there are other more complicated things like intelligence or
Yeah.
athletic ability or musical talent. Those probably would require changing hundreds or thousands of genes in order to make an impact. And those are very complicated things that are not just driven by genes, but driven by a whole variety of other things: environment, upbringing. If you're talking about intelligence, it's pretty clear that it's better if you're not exposed to toxins in the environment, if you're not exposed to lead paint, things of that sort. So it can be very complicated.
And of course, that complexity, that's something that I think we're obviously going to tackle in the future. But I guess focusing on what gene editing can do today, you mentioned that you use it in your practice, and obviously, being able to, being able to research this kind of thing. What has you excited about this? Because you mentioned that it was kind of discovered, it wasn't invented. Having a natural way to, I guess, kind of edit genes is very exciting because the body would be much more receptive to it. What has you so excited? If there's so many, if we need to be careful and cautious about what it can do, why are you so excited about
Sure.
what it can do?
Sure. So let me start by saying it's true that it wasn't discovered, but an enormous amount of work was required
Hmm.
by many talented scientists to adapt it to be able to work in the human body. So I don't want to
I got you.
minimize all that hard work in any way. But I'll give you an example. So just last week, we heard on the news that two patients, each with a blood disorder, so in one case sickle cell disease, In the other case, a disease called beta thalassemia. Both terrible diseases, both entail a lot of suffering. So
Mhm.
two patients, one with each disease, received CRISPR therapy earlier this year with the idea that it might be able to improve their condition. And what we learned last week is it not only worked, it looks like it worked really well. And these patients might actually be cured of these diseases. And that would be historic if that bears out, because these are diseases that until now have been incurable. So this is really transformative, the ability to do, this sort of treatment to cure these genetic disorders that affect tens of thousands of people in the United States and many more people around the world. So
So,
that's
yeah.
obviously very exciting.
Yeah, and by the way, I was able to find the article from a publication called Stat News. I'm not sure if you
Mhm.
have a kind of a recommended journal or publication, but we're going to throw that in the show notes for anyone who wants to check that out. It was published November 19th, so yeah, not too long ago at all. I hadn't even heard about that, and I guess this is where one of my first questions comes up about this whole thing is that, a little bit later on, we're going to be talking about your book, about the first genetically, I guess the first kind of genetically, CRISPR engineered babies,
Mhm.
and for a newly formed life or like like a new organism, uh, you can see where gene editing would obviously, really take hold because obviously most of the genes have not been, I guess, created yet. And I'm sorry if I'm mixing up all this terminology, but in existing patients, as I understand it, a person's gene, there's a copy of that in every cell of the body. How
That's
is
right.
it that something like CRISPR is able to affect, a full grown person who's been alive for, 30, 40, 50 years, and it still has that kind of effect on the entire system?
Yeah, so you raise a very good question. It turns out you don't actually need to change the gene in every cell in the body throughout the whole body. If you're talking about live breathing adults who have a disease,
Mm-hmm.
all you really need to do is change the gene in the organ that's affected or the organ that's at fault. So again, if we're talking about sickle cell disease or other blood disorders, all you would need to do is edit the gene, so to speak, in the blood cells. And so that can be done by taking bone marrow cells from the body, editing them outside of the body, and then putting them back in like a bone marrow transplant. You don't actually have to touch the rest of the body. If you're talking about just changing one organ or one set of cells, it's much more straightforward. To give you another example, something
Mm-hmm.
that's closer to my heart, no pun intended, but heart disease, something we're working on is trying to turn off cholesterol genes. And it turns out we would only need to do it in the liver because liver is where cholesterol is made. And if you turn off these genes just in the liver, you'll permanently reduce cholesterol levels in the body. And that will permanently reduce your risk, your lifetime risk of heart disease. And so you don't need to change the entire body. So I think that's a very important distinction from what we'll talk about in a bit, I
Right.
gather, which is doing editing in embryos,
Yeah.
embryos as early as a single cell.
Yeah, that's and that's going to be kind of what my next question, and then we'll lead into the babies, which is and that actually in some way answers my next question, which was obviously if you edit the genes of a person, is that going to be passed down to future generations? And I'd say this because there's been a lot of backlash against this idea of genetically modified organisms, and if people are raising this much fuss about corn that is kind of there's insect resistant, disease resistant, higher yield, like all these amazing things that, just basic crops
Mhm,
and
mhm.
cattle and so on and so forth. And people are having this huge reaction against genetically modified organisms. Um, is there anything that can affect, I guess, individuals? And I guess this idea that we should genetically modify ourselves, uh, is that a concern for anyone that you're talking to or even yourself?
Well, I think most people are sympathetic. If someone has a bad disease and is suffering from it,
Hmm.
I think most people would be sympathetic to the idea, hey, we're treating that disease. We're helping alleviate suffering. This is an urgent medical need. And so, whether you call it gene editing or genetic modification or gene surgery, as some people have called it, I think most people are on board with those sorts of uses. I think where it becomes more complicated is when you're talking about non-medical uses, some of the things you mentioned earlier, like, changing hair color or eye color, or, assuming you could even do it, changing athletic ability or
Hmm.
intelligence. I think that, gets people much more upset. The idea that you're, enhancing people.
Yeah.
Um, and so that, that's another distinction that has to be drawn. Are you talking about medical uses for people who are suffering, or are you talking about non-medical uses that are more along the lines of enhancement?
When the conversation comes up, either here on the show or in my personal life, I will say that uh, there's really not much of a distinction in most people's minds. It's I think that you're right. If you were strictly talking about diseases, they would be very sympathetic, and if you called it if you just said a blanket innovative treatment for sickle cell a disease, they'd say, "Oh, wow, that's amazing, that's great." But as soon as you talk about gene editing, they're like, "Well, where does it end?"
Yeah.
And I
The
guess
slippery
that's
slope, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
slippery slope, and
Yeah.
that's what we have to kind of stop. Is that it's there are, I guess according to you, there are completely relevant to today practical applications for CRISPR.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, there's a dividing line clearly, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. But the problem is that people will not necessarily agree where that dividing line should be. And, we're talking, very reasonable people could disagree on where the line should be drawn. Right.
But of course, as we mentioned before, things for like super intelligence and superhuman strength and things like that. If it's even possible to begin with, we're still, very, 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 that's so far in the future that it you can have the conversation now, but it probably won't affect policy when it actually comes out. So with that being said, if you don't mind, Doctor, let's go ahead and transition into this book that you wrote and
Sure.
and talk about and actually have it up there on my bookshelf right now. It's thank you for saying the copy, but it's about and the title of the book is The CRISPR Generation: The Story of the World's First Gene-Edited Babies. You led with, or at least you titled the book, alluding to this story that happened in 2018, November 2018, just about a year ago. And I'll let you go ahead and set the stage for what happened because it made headlines everywhere. And it was that, I think that was the first time I saw that slippery slope conversation happen
Sure.
on
Absolutely.
a world level. So go ahead.
Yeah. So a year ago, a Chinese scientist by the name of He Jiankui announced that he had made the first gene edited babies, human babies. So, in his mind, this was a great historical achievement, a scientific achievement. He probably had visions that someday he would be lauded as, a pioneer in modern medicine, maybe be in the running for a Nobel Prize. It did not turn out that way. And it turns out that his attempt to make these babies, he did make the babies, but his attempts were highly dubious, both in a scientific sense as well as an ethical sense.
Mm.
So one problem is that this is a relatively new technology, CRISPR. We don't yet have a full grasp on how to make it work most effectively and, more importantly, how to make it work safely. So, as with any new technology, I like to compare CRISPR to fire. If you are careful, if you're keeping a close eye on it, if you're regulating it very carefully, it can do an enormous amount of good. But if it gets out of control, it can, start a wildfire and actually do lots of damage and hurt a lot of people. And so, most technologies are like this. New revolutionary technology, they have the potential for both good and bad. Now,
Hmm.
this particular Chinese scientist apparently thought he knew what he was doing and used CRISPR in embryos. And what he told the parents is, I'm going to make your babies resistant to HIV. And his plan was to turn off a gene called CCR5. And the reason he did this is because there are people naturally born who have this gene turned off, and it turns out they're resistant to HIV. Now, here's the problem: he didn't have full control over what CRISPR was doing. And it made some edits in CCR5, but the editing was probably incomplete. So it's
Mm.
not clear the kids who were born would actually get this HIV resistance. And then the potential problem with CRISPR is that it might inadvertently make edits elsewhere. It might edit other genes that you don't want to be edited. And that can have potential harmful consequences to health. And it looks like, from the data we have available, that some of these so target edits, some of these unintended edits elsewhere in the genome did occur.
Hmm.
And the health consequences for these children is entirely unknown. We know that two twin sisters were born. They have some editing of the gene that was intended to protect against HIV. They almost certainly have other edited genes. Implications unclear. They have the potential to pass these edits on to their own children. So then it's an open question: would you even let them have children without undergoing in vitro fertilization and
Hmm.
screening their embryos and making sure there are no mutations that inadvertently get passed on? All sorts of scientific questions that we don't have good answers to because no one has ever done this. Now, that's on the one hand, the scientific problems. Then
Right.
there are the ethical problems. He acted very irresponsibly. He did his work in secrecy. There was no oversight. There was no transparency. He thought he had enough mastery of the technology that he could do everything on his own. Mind you, this is a guy who has no medical training. He is not a physician. He trained as a physicist, crossed over into, I would say, biophysics research, had no medical training, had no training in doing clinical trials. And yet here he is thinking that he could basically single handedly run a clinical trial, do experiments using this, very new technology, doing experiments on unborn human beings.
Mm.
Um, and the way in which he did it was not at all consistent with the way that clinical trials should be done. They need to be done carefully. There need to be a lot of people involved. There needs to be regulators who are keeping track of things, making sure that all the T's are crossed and all the I's are dotted, that everything is done in as safe a way as possible. He didn't do any of that. He just forged ahead, and did it on his own, basically.
So,
There's this
and
science, there's this scientific trope
yeah.
of the rogue scientist. This guy was his rogue scientist for sure.
Yeah, and of course, I took one class in college, so I feel I'm an expert about essentially the ethics part of experimentation. Like, I think they made us like go through that little segment before they said, "All right, all freshmen are now test subjects for all the upperclassmen." So good luck with that. And they and so they show us this, and the time when science was a little bit more, turning a blind eye to the ethics of science, a lot of data is still poured over today based on experiments done in the 50s. Like, what happens if you did take a child and close them off in a room for 7 years without any human contact? Would they develop speech or things like that? And,
Yeah, yeah.
it's horrible. Obviously, the kid is never going to be okay. And that would never happen today. But the, kind of the data and what happened there, what is still found very valuable. It's just, we would never, for obvious reasons, get that, do that again. Even in some sense, and I'm not saying that he's right or anything like that, would the scientific community, kind of say that, and I guess because you mentioned scientifically, it was pretty shoddy work to begin with, and ethically, it was, very reprehensible what he did. Did anything come out of this other than two kids with a questionable future?
I think what he showed is all the things that can go wrong with CRISPR gene editing, especially in embryos. If you're not careful, if you don't have oversight, if you don't know what you're doing, if you're arrogant and, on the other hand, incompetent. I mean, those are strong words, but I really feel strongly that those words are relevant here. I think it's a cautionary tale. I think there are lessons to be learned. I think if anyone in the near future or the far future uh, decides that this is something that needs to be done for whatever purpose, whether it's medical or non-medical, editing of embryos, they need to look to this as a lesson, as a warning
Mm-hmm.
as to what things to avoid, how not to do the editing, how to do it much more safely.
Yeah, and of course doing it safely, and like you mentioned, the kind of what we can do with it today, and cure these diseases. You mentioned that some of the other side effects of this are it may have edited genes that previously didn't need to be touched. We talked about the benefits of fixing broken genes, but I guess if you want to, maybe outline a little bit of what can happen if you break genes, if you damage genes that aren't supposed to be damaged. You mentioned that a couple specific ones are like sickle cell and so on and so forth. But what can happen? Like, is there any way to tell what can happen if other genes are damaged?
Sure. So the big concern we have is cancer. And so the reason for that is in most cases, if you want to cause bad disease, you have to make, edits in a lot of cells and multiple organs. Not always, but it's not necessarily so straightforward that, having inadvertent edits in some places in some genes are going to cause big problems. But cancer is a different story. And that has to do with how cancer arises. Cancer arises from a single cell that gets mutated for whatever reason, whether it's toxins in the environment or radiation from space or just genetic accidents. It all starts with a single cell. That cell picks up a mutation, then it picks up another mutation. It starts to divide. And then, those cells pick up more mutations and then they have uncontrolled growth and you end up with a tumor and it potentially spreads across the entire body. And if
Mm.
not successfully treated, leads to death. And so the real concern with this inadvertent editing of other genes is you accidentally turn off or activate a gene that puts cells down the road towards becoming tumors, towards causing cancer. And you don't have to affect many cells. If even a few cells get those bad edits, those harmful edits, those cells can grow and become cancer.
And to find this out, I mean, I'm sure that there are clinical trials happening, all the time about this, for consenting adults who, I guess, in a lot of these situations, they're either going to, it's, as I understand it, especially risky treatment or, depending on the risk factor, they say, hey, this is your only shot. Everything else has been exhausted. Would you like to try this experiment? And essentially you get consent for, kind of editing these genes and, having these trials. Very clearly when you have a baby or even an embryo that's, maybe even single cell, they can't sign a paper. They can't do that.
That's right.
And so consent, I guess, is one of the big problems here.
Sure. The parents, in principle, the parents are the ones consenting for a child. Anytime a child needs medical treatment, it becomes even stickier when you're talking about an unborn child, an embryo, because the editing occurs before the embryo is actually used to establish a pregnancy. So it's all
Yeah.
happening outside the body, right? It's what we call test tube babies, in vitro fertilization, uniting the egg and the sperm to make the embryo in the test tube. Really, it's more like a dish. But outside of the body, and then you let that grow, and then at some point after about a week you then transfer that into a mother to establish the pregnancy. The editing that happens here, it happens before the pregnancy is established. So obviously an embryo can't give consent, and 9 months later a kid is born. That kid had no ability to consent with what happened
Mm.
before the pregnancy even occurred. And then here's the other issue. It's not just that kid, but if that kid has edits all throughout his or her body, those edits will be in the sperm cells or the egg cells and can pass it on to the next generation. So you're not even just talking about one person, you're potentially talking about
So,
many
and
people down the generations.
yeah, and sorry to step on you there, but I wanted to know that um, you mentioned that it was to make these children HIV resistant, and
Yep.
HIV resistance is, of course, would be a very good thing. I'm sure that HIV, if we could somehow end HIV in my lifetime, that'd be amazing. Great. I'm sure that people are working on it. Were these kids, going to be predisposed to HIV either through one of the parents? Were they at a high risk for this? Because there are other forms of controlling for HIV that include medication that you can take, kind of orally. There's, of course, contraception and things like that. There seems to be, a lot of ways that we can control HIV, and we've gotten very good at it, as I understand. Was this even necessary? Like, were they going to have HIV and the doctor said, this is the only way, there's no other way, we have to do this? Or again, was it just as rogue can be?
You're asking exactly the right questions. And so in this case, I would argue strongly that there was no need. So in this case, these particular twin girls, the father was HIV positive, but he was on medication to suppress the virus in his body. So he wasn't actually at all sick or even, having virus, teeming in his blood or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
There was really no chance. We know that HIV is not spread through casual contact. We've known that forever, right? There needs to be an exchange of fluids and there needs to be active virus.
Yeah.
There's basically no chance that these kids are going to get HIV from their treated father. The prevalence of HIV infection in China is 0.1% or so, and the chance of these kids getting HIV in their lifetimes are no different than the average Chinese citizen. So we're talking 0.1%.
Hmm.
And even if they did get the HIV virus, however it happened, their treatments, right? No one, very few people, I would say, actually progress to full blown AIDS and actually die from AIDS anymore.
Yeah.
And then that's discounting the possibility, hey, these kids are going to live hopefully 60, 70, 80 years. There's going to be progress. There'll probably be an HIV vaccine sooner or later. Exactly as you said, there's so many options. There was no real need to make these kids HIV resistant. And when you consider that there was basically no benefit of this procedure, then you really have to worry, wow, what were all the risks that were entailed? These are not kids who are going to die if they didn't get the treatment. So why are we exposing them to risk if there was no potential for benefit?
And that again goes back to the scientists who felt, and really, I would like you to speak a little bit to your research for writing this book. I'm not sure if you were able to get in contact with the scientists, because I'm sure that, actually, I'm not even sure, because I don't even know what the Chinese government would do in a situation like this, or even if or when they knew about it or things like that. But talk about the research going into this book. Did you just talk with other experts in the field? Did you get a chance to talk with the lead scientists who did this? How was writing the book?
So what's interesting is that I actually, have firsthand experience. The book is written from a first-person point of view,
Mm-hmm.
and throughout most of it, and that's because I lived through it, and not because I was collaborating with this guy in China or in any way involved in his work, but I had an insiderish view for two reasons. First, early on, soon after the twins were born, this was late October or early November last year. It's not exactly clear when they were born. When that happened, this Chinese scientist reached out to the Associated Press through intermediaries, um, or somehow became connected to the Associated Press, offered them an exclusive story. The Associated Press didn't know what to make of this. They weren't sure whether this was for real or whether this was a hoax. There have been, pretty high profile hoaxes of this kind in the past. About 15 years ago, you may remember there was an announcement by a cult that they had made cloned human babies,
Mm-hmm.
and that turned out to be a hoax.
Right.
And so the Associated Press was really worried that this was a hoax, and so they insisted that this Chinese scientist give them a manuscript he was planning to write or was in the process of writing to submit to a scientific journal. And they had the opportunity, the permission, if you will, to give that to a few independent experts to evaluate the validity of the work. And I ended up being one of those independent experts. This was all before the news broke. This was all done under embargo conditions or confidential conditions. I read the manuscript and immediately realized, looking at the data, that things had gone terribly wrong with the editing, that it had not worked in the way that it was supposed to, that there were unintended edits, that the editing that was intended was very sloppy, that there were ethical issues. So I immediately got a sense of what was going on and was able to tell the Associated Press, hey, there are serious problems, but this is for real. This is not a hoax, because if this were a hoax, they would have made everything look squeaky clean. They would have made everything look perfect.
Mm.
It makes no sense that the data looked so horrible, um, that it was anything except a real thing that had happened, and they had just messed up royally. So that's how I knew that these twins, it was not a hoax. These are live human beings that unfortunately had, something really bad done to them when you come right down to it. And so
Yeah.
I lived through this, and then I was witness to events as they unfolded, as the news broke. Um, I was involved in a lot of press interviews when the news broke, because the Associated Press quoted some of my commentary about what had gone wrong. There were a video interview with the Associated Press, and so
Mm-hmm.
then many other press outlets saw that and came to me wanting to know what exactly had happened, and I shared what I knew, based on what was in this manuscript that I was given. And
And
then
then
I
I'm
had my
sure after the 100th time you threw up your hands and said, "You know what? Forget it. I'll write a book." And then
yeah. So I realized, yeah, that's exactly right. Like, I was telling the same story over and over again, which I don't mind, but then I realized, wow, for posterity's sake, because I have this inside knowledge of what was going on, better to put it down on paper and share it as widely as possible. Now, it's interesting because the other way, it turns out I'm connected to this guy totally inadvertently, and I didn't even realize this until the news broke. I had no
Yep.
idea who he was. It turns out he had actually had one of his students reach out to me for help a year before the twins were born because he wanted advice on how to uh, do things more similar to what I work on, which is turning off cholesterol genes. He was intending to turn off a cholesterol gene in embryos with the idea of protecting them against heart disease. Entirely unnecessary. Heart disease is a disease that happens typically in elderly patients. You don't need to be treating cholesterol or worrying about cholesterol before someone's born or even after they're born. You can wait until they're young adults and can, consent to any procedure that's done. But that was what he had in mind. And he had a student reach out to me asking for help and advice and even things I had made in my laboratory that would make their work easier. I didn't engage at all. I did not offer the slightest bit of help. The only thing I said was, I think this is a bad idea. And then I stopped answering their emails asking for help. But it turns out I had this connection to the guy, and so some of that is in the book as well. My experiences. So
Yeah.
it's not the position I really wanted to be in, but I actually did end up having sort of an insiderish view, firsthand experiences that I was able to relate in the book.
Yeah, I'm actually my brother, who's been on the show a couple times, so the audience knows him. But he's actually about a semester away from getting his PhD in chemistry, and he's working in a lab setting and things like that. And yeah, the amount of collaboration and the people he's had the opportunity to work with happens all the time. It's very interesting. How open the academic community is, but I guess in some regards, and I guess China in particular has a reputation that I don't feel like getting into, but the science coming out of there in some ways is let's just say dubious. So, and I'm not saying that everything out of there is bad, but I can see why you chose not to engage with them, especially if they were just looking to do something that a year before this was unnecessary, and then he made headlines by doing something again unnecessary
Yeah,
and very
exactly.
critical. So with that being said, I from your from your comments just now, that I have two questions for you. The first one, I think I'll do the second one first, but the second one is, how would this happen in a good setting? Like, obviously I'm assuming that there should be a time and a place. You work with CRISPR, so you would know better than I would. But I'm assuming that there is a time and a place where this would be the right call, where for some reason we need to perform gene editing on an embryo or someone's kids or the like. How do you see this happening in a good controlled setting, or is there a time that that's going to happen?
Yeah, so I think, first and foremost, society needs to decide whether this is a good thing to do, whether this is an appropriate thing to do, and if so, in which situations. Going back to what we were talking about earlier, what is the distinction between medical versus non-medical applications? Where do you draw that line? No one person has the answer or should have the answer and decide for everyone else. I think this is something that needs to be decided by society. And, it's a little bit of a vague term, but what I'm envisioning is, you're talking about local communities, you're talking about countries, there are processes in place. There are regulators and legislators, and there's, at least in principle, there are avenues to get feedback from the general public and then use that to craft laws and regulations and decide what is appropriate and what is not. I should note that in the United States right now in 2019, it would be illegal to do anything like this, to do any editing of embryos for medical purposes, for non-medical purposes, for anything, period. It just is not allowed in the United States. Laws can change, but right now, illegal in the United States. Other countries, are much more open or have no laws, haven't thought about this at all. China originally, it didn't seem like there were any laws.
Yep.
But after all this happened, they've swung 180 degrees. And now, if anything, they have some of the strongest laws, or at least they claim to publicly that they have some of the strongest laws against this sort of thing. And
Yeah.
so this is very important. Before the scientists or the physicians rush in, there needs to be a consensus for any given society that this is an appropriate thing to do.
Yeah, and of course, for certain things, I mean, for certain treatments and the whatnot, we've had rulings come down, I'm sure, from, or I guess guidelines by, let's say, the United Nations, as effective as they are for, certain types of treatments and procedures that are, considered inhumane and the like. So I'm sure that you're talking something along those lines, where you do have that large international or even just a nation's conversation about this, and that happens.
Absolutely.
So something along those lines. My first question that I was going to ask you was, when you were talking about the kids, you said we know that they were born between this date and this date. Late October, early November. You mentioned that it was two twin girls. You haven't said a name. You haven't said the parents. You haven't said anything like that. Do we really?
Yeah.
Do we really know the identity of the kids? Because I think that for privacy's sake and whatnot, that wasn't really publicly released. But even beyond that, just to keep an eye on them and to make sure that they're going to be receiving the treatment that they might need later in life. Do we know the identity, and is that a problem if we do or don't?
So we do not know the identity. That has been kept under close wraps. All we have are their pseudonyms. They're
Hmm.
known by Lulu and Nana, not their real names. We don't know who the parents are. They go by the pseudonyms Mark and Grace, apparently. What we do have is a public announcement, essentially, from the Chinese government. This was back in January, so we're talking, quite a while ago now, and that's the last we've heard on this issue. But the Chinese government announced that they had performed an investigation in the wake of the news breaking and all the, controversy that arose and all the backlash. The Chinese government carried out an investigation, concluded that yes, in fact, this was real, this was not a hoax, and that there are twin girls. And they made a statement to the effect that they will be provided for, whatever medical needs or whatnot they have. It's hard to know what that means.
Hmm.
Are they going to be poked and prodded and treated, like experimental subjects because they were the first, in our history really to be subjected to this kind of procedure? Are they going to be left alone? Are they going to be given medical care in the sense that they'll just be routinely monitored in the way that most people are routinely monitored, yearly checkups or whatnot? Or will there be more intensive monitoring? We really have no answers to these questions. The Chinese government has not said anything publicly, and I think it's very unlikely they will ever say anything publicly. Will their identities ever be publicly known? Will they even be told themselves that they were subjected to this experiment? How much do their families know?
Hmm.
Are they going to be treated differently because of this? So many unanswered questions, right?
Yeah. And that's just from a social aspect. How
Yeah.
are these kids going to, of course, kind of cope with that? Yeah, it's and of course the news that the Chinese government, like you said back in January, that was their last announcement that they were going to provide for them, and yeah, they were going to investigate, and that's uh, coming from, I guess, a tech point of view. And when we hear about the Chinese government, it's usually through unlawful surveillance, or I guess to them it would be lawful surveillance, it would be mass surveillance, it would be I guess security things and hacking and whatnot. The Chinese government's very good about keeping things under wraps. So
Mhm.
I'm not sure how much more we're going to be able to hear about that. Let's go ahead and by the way, Doctor, I want to thank you for your time, because
Of course.
your interview is actually going much farther than our typical interview. But I did want to ask just a couple more questions, and actually, this last one was kind of related to what I said. But we have this question here: what are 3 reasons that future parents would choose to pursue gene editing on behalf of their unborn child? Because we mentioned that disease control, and I'm sure that you have others, but in adults, CRISPR's doing amazing work. You're working with it yourself, but for the unborn, what 3 reasons would you give to maybe pursue this?
Yeah, that's very, very important question as we think about this. So in my mind, there are 3 possible scenarios. So first scenario, the parents themselves have medical issues that would make it impossible for them to have healthy biological children unless they use gene editing. They both have a severe disease, and because of the way genetics works, they would be guaranteed to pass that disease along to a child unless editing were done to fix the gene that was at fault. Now, these are very unusual cases, but they do exist.
Hmm.
And so you have to give that serious consideration. The second scenario is where parents might want to reduce their risk, or rather their child's risk, of having a serious disease in the lifetime. And so we're talking about common diseases that affect a lot of people. You're talking about breast cancer or Alzheimer's disease or heart disease.
Hmm.
Now, there's no guarantee that, any given child would definitely develop that disease for sure. These are common diseases. Some people get it, some people don't. It's partly genetics, but partly environment and lifestyle choices. There's no guarantee, by the way, that the editing will completely eliminate the risk, right? So you turn off a cholesterol gene if you're talking about heart disease, but if you behave badly and smoke and have diabetes and high blood pressure, you might still get heart disease, even if your genetics are favorable. But the idea here is parents would be stacking the odds in their child's favor, right? So reducing risk. So maybe from, I'm throwing out random numbers, but 60% chance of getting a disease to 20% chance
Right.
of getting a disease. And you can imagine why parents might want to do that, do the best thing for their child. And then that third scenario that I mentioned, this is really getting back to enhancement, what we talked about earlier, non-medical applications, but conferring desirable traits on the children. And of course, what's desirable is a little bit in the eye of the beholder, but it could be cosmetic changes like eye color, hair color. It could be more substantial things like intelligence, athletic ability, musical talent. So in my mind, they're really like these three use cases, these three scenarios. And I don't think it's going to be possible to get a full consensus covering all of those scenarios. I think it's going to be much more nuanced. And the reason I say that is in public polling of the general public, and there have been a variety of polls that have been taken over the last few years on this issue. What you'll find is that the majority of people are very sympathetic to the first scenario, and almost as many people are sympathetic to the second scenario because those are more medical uses, especially that first one where it's really about the ability to have a healthy biological child.
Right.
If you can't have a healthy biological child unless you do editing, I think there's sympathy for that. That third scenario, interestingly enough, about enhancement, almost nobody likes that. Everyone hates it. Support plummets to like a few percent. There's very clearly, a distinction there. And I think what it comes down to is that, you know, people tend to be much more sympathetic to parents who would not otherwise be able to have a healthy biological child, and much less sympathetic to parents who, would use gene editing to try to make their kids better than everyone else's, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah, and I'm trying to think of a movie that came out, I think in the 2000s, that had a premise where they would, and the people within the movie, they would screen the embryos and the potential kids for any kind of diseases and risk, and scan the parents, and they were saying that we were going to have a kid naturally and not in a test tube, and the whole movie was like, that's so unethical of you.
Yeah.
And that was a reflection of the time where, kind of taking the test tube baby of the 2000s and saying, well, maybe one day that's where all kids are going to come from because it's safer, it's better for the kids, better for the parents, and it's just going to be better. And, having a kid naturally is going to seem very unnatural. I can't recall the movie, but it was pretty interesting. And then, of course,
I think you're referring to Gattaca.
Gattaca, and that probably was it.
Same thing you were,
So
yeah.
actually, I was 97 because that movie came up, and I thought, no, that couldn't be it. It was 97. So there's that movie, and then I also found a movie coming out, or I should say, a series on Netflix called Unnatural Selection, which is probably going to tackle about the same thing. I wanted you to speak to the audience real quick as more of these movies come, movies and television shows, and it's going to come up in media. What do you want people to take away about CRISPR, because it's been promised to do so much. I've heard grand sweeping statements like it's going to, it might unlock the key, and of course they always throw the might in there. It might unlock the key to curing cancer, to curing all kinds of diseases, making us better, stronger, faster, smarter. But there's also the dark side to it. What would you like people to know about the reality of this technology?
Yeah, the reality the reality of this technology is really no different from any other major technology that has emerged in our history, and that is that it has the potential for good, and it also has the potential for bad. So it's less about the technology itself and more about how people use the technology and their motives in using the technology. This is a medical technology that I agree has great potential to be a boon to the health of patients who otherwise, would be destined to a life of suffering and illness. But on the flip side, you can also see this technology being used for less noble purposes, for enhancement, for as I said before, trying to make your kids better than everyone else's, and that could lead to inequities. There could be issues of access.
Mm-hmm.
Wealthier parents might be able to use this technology, and poorer parents might not have access to this technology, and so that has clear ethical and social implications. There's the potential for the technology, if used, very haphazardly or sloppily, as was really the case with this Chinese scientist last year, to potentially do more harm than good. And so, you have to accept the reality that there's good, there's bad, probably some of both is gonna happen no matter what you do or how you try to legislate or regulate.
Right.
But hope for and focus on the positive aspects, and if it comes to it, lobby your legislators and regulators to really try to create a regulatory framework that facilitates the good uses of this technology and holds back inappropriate, potentially harmful uses of the technology.
So you're definitely in the camp of it's good when used with measure, and that's
Mhm.
and of course, as you mentioned, you're using it, so I can completely see where that comes into play, and I definitely like that all the points you brought up. Those are the exact same points that when we have the conversation here on the show, not with anyone with your kind of credentials, those are the same points that we also hit on. So I think that the questions are out there. Now it's time to have that conversation. And honestly, I hope that in 10 years, it's kind of like stem cell research, where I remember stem cells were the most controversial thing because we were getting them from, of course, embryos. But after people got comfortable with the idea and we were able to get stem cells from different sources, stem cells became almost like almost like a boring topic. It's like, oh, stem cells, it's
Yeah,
great, it's doing amazing work, but it was like a known entity. And I hope that gene editing becomes much like that.
I think you're right. It will certainly sooner or later.
Absolutely. So everyone, if you enjoyed that, we've been talking to Dr. Musunuru, and of course he wrote the CRISPR Generation. We're going to put a link to that in the show notes, and of course available through Amazon. I see that's your primary choice. Also, you can get it free through Kindle, which is great. I actually had a lot of fun reading it, and I definitely had a lot of fun talking to you about this, because this is this is one of those topics that, even though Computer America is a tech show, I think that this is one of those things that it's very high tech, just in a little bit different
For
way. So I
sure.
want to thank you for your time and coming on the program.
Thanks for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Our pleasure, our pleasure. So hey, until next time, thank you so much. And again, computeramerica.com. We'll check all that out. And Kieran, have a great day. Thank you so much.
You too.
All
Take
right, bye
care.
bye. All right, everyone, and there he goes. And of course, we're going to do computer and technology news, and this is where we try to cover all the latest stories and things like that. So everyone, just sit back, relax. We have time for one, maybe two stories, and then of course we'll go on. That'll be the end. That will be the end of the show. So with that being said, computer and technology news brought to you by Computer America. Here we go. So this is one of the stories that I wanted to cover because it happens so often that it kind of warrants its own little segment. And it's this idea of maps, where you would think in a day and age where we have satellites that are constantly pointing down to the earth, where we have maps that can be created to a fraction of a meter, or I guess foot if you are American, to a very precise degree. You have these maps that should be perfect. Everyone has agreed upon borders. It's all okay. But if human history has taught us anything, it's that, well, when a country is restless, they will try to expand their borders as best they can. We think ourselves better than our ancient ancestors, who would pull up a map and go, hey, this is our land. Look at this map. It's from 1500. And then they would pull out a map from the 1400s and go, this is our map from the 1400s. And then they would go, your map is crap. My map is awesome. And then they would fight over it. Well, maps are still actually a big problem, and you can have the funny side of it. There's a whole subreddit if you happen to frequent Reddit. I believe there's a subreddit called Maps Without New Zealand, and those are of course maps that do not depict the entire landmass of New Zealand. Many friends of the show are from New Zealand, so they apparently don't exist. So there's the fun part of that. But then, of course, there is the more menacing side, where if you can control the borders, if you can control the narrative, you can lay claim, or your country can lay claim to certain regions of, of territories. And what I mean by that is, of course, you have the likes of China, which is using maps all over the world to depict that they have control over certain islands, and their control extends 200 meters into the ocean, and they claim control over things like Thailand and Hong Kong and many of the islands and South Pacific islands and things like that. And if you show one of the maps that don't dictate that, even though that is not recognized by anyone other than China, then they will retaliate. I think that the NBA tried to show a map of China that did not include that, and they had to issue a formal apology for displaying the quote-unquote wrong map, even though the map was, by everyone else's standards other than China's, correct. And now Russia seems to have the same issue, where now Russia is demanding that Apple, here's where the tech comes in, Apple change Crimea to meet Russian demands. And you can see here that Apple has complied with Russian demands to show Crimea as part of Russian territory on its apps. Of course, the whole thing with Crimea, if you don't remember, Russia annexed Crimea from Ukraine in 2014, in a move that was condemned by most of the global community. However, Apple Maps and weather do not show Crimea as part of the country when viewed outside of Russia. And the State Duma, the Russian parliament's lower house, said in a statement, Crimea and Sevastopol now appear on Apple's device as Russian territory. Russia treats the naval port city of Sevastopol as a separate region. Apple has been in talks with Russia for several months over State Duma described as inaccuracy in the way Crimea was labeled. And so with that being said, Apple has not yet commented on the decision. He said that Russia has an open dialogue and constructive cooperation with foreign companies. Google, which also produces similar maps, does not show Crimea belonging to either Russia or Ukraine on its maps. However, it uses the Russian spelling of Crimean place names on its maps in Russia rather than the Ukrainian spelling, which of course would show a Russian bias. And if you're wondering, well, why does that matter, Ben? Does it really matter for the people there? Yes, it matters to the people there because they're still fighting for their independence. They're still very much against this hostile takeover, or if you're on the other side, they're still very much for reuniting with their neighbors. That it's essentially political pressure on tech companies to further the narrative, because depending on which way you go, if a person only sees maps, let's say of China, that show that they have control over the Southeast Asian territories, then people will go, oh, of course, that's Chinese land. And even though it was never formally recognized as such, if people eventually just kind of believe it to be true over time, these countries, Russia will know, China will know, America knows that if someone believes that you're part of the country for 100 years, then 100 years later, it's just going to be part of the country. That's just the way it's going to go. So controlling the maps actually does help further their mission and their mission statement. And, well, now we have this whole hubbub with Apple in Crimea. It's not like Apple's not the problem here. It's that foreign powers are able to exert such influence on American companies, and of course, just for political gain. There you have it. And just, hey, roping them into it. I do not envy being a tech company. It seems like a very rough place to be. So everyone, with that being said, I think we're going to call it a day. The music in the background means that we're just about done. If you'd like to check out more of Computer America, computeramerica.com. Once again, thank you so much to the author of the CRISPR Generation. Go check out the book, available on Amazon, and everyone, links in the show notes. Until next time, have a great day. Thank you so much, And hey, hopefully you enjoyed the show. Computer America, Monday through Friday, 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern. Check us out at CES 2020. We'll be out there. And until then, have a great day. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.